Welcome back. Today we are attempting Edexcel paper 1 due May 2023, obviously the microeconomics paper, and let's get right onto it with section A. So let's get started with section A. So what do? As soon as what is our normal strategy? As soon as we go to the question, we don't read the stem, we go straight to the question and then read the stem. So let's go about doing that. So with the reference to the information provided, explain one advantage. So my pen's not back. So look for one advantage of the free market economy, and this is 4 marks. And remember, I said this in the section A tips video, if you ever get a 4-mark worded question, 1 mark is always, at least 1 mark is reserved for application. So you need to make sure, where's the application going to come from? It's going to come from this, so the stem you've been given. So let's have a read of this as well. So the question is asking us the advantage of the free market economy, and then we've got mention of the command economy. The Cuban government will allow private businesses to operate in most fields, some sort of the economy, create jobs. Okay, so basically, what's the stem telling us? The Cuban economy, the Cuban government is now moving from a command. And just a bit of revision if you do not remember, command economy, the resources are allocated by the state and no markets exist, whereas a free market economy, the resources are allocated by the price mechanism, which we say leads to eventually an efficient allocation of resources. So the question's basically asking us, give an advantage of the free market economy over the command economy. And this has a really good link to a different part of the spec, which is nationalisation versus privatisation. It's a really good 25 marker, 15 marker you can get at Edexcel, and it's a good one to prep for. But one of the major advantages of privatising a firm, so moving a firm from the public sector to the private sector, so basically from being government owned to now a private businessman owning it, is that when a firm is privatised, the firm regains its profit incentive. As we know, the classic economic assumption is that all firms have a profit incentive and want to profit maximize. But when a firm is controlled by the government, when it's getting funded by taxpayers' money, they lose that profit incentive. Why? Because they chase other objectives. They want to be actively efficient. They want to provide as much welfare to society as possible. Therefore, they don't have that core objective of profit maximizing. Then what happens? When they don't have that objective of profit maximizing, costs increase, costs spiral out of control, and basically the firm becomes very inefficient. And of course, with high costs, eventually that is going to be translated onto consumers with higher prices. But how would I word my answer to this question? So I'd say the Cuban move from a command economy to a free market economy is positive, as E.G will help jumpstart the economy and create new jobs. And why is that? As there is now a profit incentive, meaning firms have to cut costs and become more efficient, and this leads to lower prices for consumers. And there's also other points you can talk about, like more consumer choice, because there's more goods in the market, there's more firms in the market. You don't want better quality since there's more firms in the market, and there's now an incentive to invest into things like dynamic efficiency. As in when it's controlled by the state, when it's controlled by the government, they're not very dynamically efficient. Why? There's no competition, there's no need to innovate. Whereas when they're in the free market economy, they're competing with other firms. Therefore, there's more incentive for these firms to innovate and make their product better, which of course, at the end of the day, leads to better outcomes for consumers. And that would score you the 4 marks on this question. So moving on to the next question, which is a multiple choice, still on number 1, so still 1 of the 5 marks. So, which of the following economic thinkers supported the idea of the command economy? So this looks like quite an easy question, and let's get on with it. Process of elimination. So Adam Smith is definitely not one of these. So which of the following economic thinkers supported the idea of the command economy? So Adam Smith, of course, did not support the idea of the command economy. He was a very free market economist. He made the invisible hand. So invisible hand very much contradicts the command economy. And Hayek as well. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing that right, but he was also a big free market economist. So these first 2 are definitely wrong. We have John Maynard Keynes, who founded Keynesian economics, obviously a very influential figure. But his strategy was, during recessions, we want the government to spend lots of money to get us out of the recession. Although he did believe in state control, it was more a mixed economy rather than a outright command economy. So it would, and that's the one I probably believe students would get most confused on. It'd be between these 2 pretty much. But yeah, it would not be Keynesian economics, and Karl Marx did believe in the command economy, so it would in fact be D. Okay, that is question 1 done, and I just had to get 5 marks on question 1. Let's move on to question 2. So, like I always do, let's get straight on with the question. So, it's calculate 2 marks. Calculate the opportunity cost of the decision by the farmer to harvest 6 units of wheat. So 6 units of wheat, and looks like we've got a PPF. So 6 units of wheat this year at point Y. So movement of point X to point Y. So the question is essentially asking us the movement from point X to point Y. So we start at point X and then we are moving to point Y. So what changes? What's the opportunity cost for moving from point X to point Y? And let's just write this out. So opportunity cost X to Y. So let's see, what is the opportunity cost? So the farmer is of course moving to point Y since he wants more wheat, and he's getting he's getting 2 more wheat by producing at point Y. But what's the opportunity cost? So what does he lose out by producing 2 more wheat? He loses out on 1 oat. So by producing 2 more wheat, because the farmer's main objective is to produce these 2 more wheat. But what does he lose out on by producing these 2 more wheat? Is that 1 oat. So the opportunity cost would equal to 1 oat, not oats, 1 oat. And just for the second mark here, I am going to also write by moving from point X to point Y, the farmer does also gain 2 units of wheat. And that would be enough to score you 2 out of 2 there. Let's move on to the next question. So it's an explain question and it's 2 marks. Explain the impact on efficiency of producing at point W, and as I can remember, point W is a point inside the PPF in the following year. So it's basically asking you, what is the impact on efficiency by producing at a point inside the PPF? Of course, if you remember back to PPFs, it's a very early topic, but points along the PPF are classed as productively efficient. Any points inside the PPF are classed, of course, as productively inefficient. Why? As we're not using our resources to the maximum extent, and then points outside of PPF are just classed as simply impossible. So let's write this down. So explain the impact on efficiency by producing at point W. So this would be productively inefficient, and is, remember, 2 marks explain question. So you're going to have to give a reason. Why is it productively inefficient? As not as I'm going to say as the spare capacity, the spare capacity slash not using resources to maximum, not using resources to maximum. So productively inefficient as there's still some spare capacity slash we're not using our resources to the maximum extent. Basically we're not producing the maximum amount, and that would be enough to get you 2 marks there on an explain question. Always remember, so that is our point, but then since it's explain, you always need to give basically like a chain of analysis a reason. So that is 4 out of 5 marks bagged. Remember, your section is 5 5-mark questions, so there's going to be 1 mark here, which is a multiple choice. Let's have a shot at this. So which of the following is most likely to help the farmer reach point Z? And if I remember correctly, point Z is the point which said was impossible. So the only way we can reach this, so it's impossible currently, but the only way the farmer can reach this point if something causes the PPF to shift outwards. So we would need an increase in the maximum possible potential of wheat production and oats. So the question is basically asking us, this can give us lots of factors, and which one would actually cause the PPF to shift outwards. So let's have a read of these. So an increase in the investment of milk production machinery. Now this is about wheat and oats. So an increase in the milk production machinery would probably not help shift the PPF out, so it's not going to be part A. B, so an increase in investment in modern farming technology. I would say this is going to shift the PPF out. Why? Since if we invest in modern farming technology, it might make us more efficient, for example, meaning we can harvest more wheat and more oats. And if we can harvest more, remember, what is a PPF? It's a production possibility frontier, and it shows the maximum output of those goods. So if we can harvest more, it means the maximum output is higher, meaning that the PPF will shift outwards. So B would be correct, but let's check the last 2 just for revision's sake. An increase in demand for wheat. PPF, of course, does not show demand, so that would not be one of the factors. An increase in price of oats, that would also not help the farmers because PPF has nothing to do with the price. So by the process of elimination, the answer would be B, and it's basically saying the factor that would cause a shift out of the PPF is investment in modern farming technology. And that is 5 out of 5 marks bagged for question 2. Let's move on to question 3. So the likely income elasticity of demand, or some of you may know as YED, or for a luxury good is, and this is a bit of a content knowledge test. So what is YED? How do you calculate YED? It's percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in income. Now in this category there are 2 types of goods. There are luxury goods and normal goods or necessities. Now let's think about the formula. I'm going to give you the answer. I'm going to explain why the answer makes sense. As in the exam, it's very likely you're going to get a PD, YED, XED question, and if you can understand why the answer is the answer, you'll be able to remember it. It's not just about relying on your recall to remember, oh, this PD value means this. Is if you fully understand the formula, understand why a positive PD value means this, a negative PD value means that. It means in your exam, you're basically foolproof. You can basically always pick up the marks without having to rely on your recall. But let's think about this. So a necessity good. And let's think about how changes in income affect it. So if we have an increase in income, what is the percentage change in quantity demanded of necessity goods going to be? So if you get a pay rise from 30,000 to 33,000, a 10% pay rise, are you likely to go and buy more toothpaste, more bread, more milk? Not really. Maybe you'll buy, instead of buying one loaf of bread, you buy two because you can afford it. But the quantity demanded will increase ever so slightly with an increase in income when we talk about necessity goods, since usually people already buy their necessities and buy how much they need. Whereas on the opposite side of the spectrum, if you think about luxury goods, so we have an increase in income. So if our income's increased from 30,000 to 33,000, how much more is our quantity demanded likely to increase? Our quantity demanded is likely to increase quite a lot more, much more, since when we get a pay rise, we want to spend, instead of spending on more bread and milk, we want to buy like a nice watch, a nice car, for example. Now let's put a value on that. So for example, a 10% rise in income might lead to a 30% increase in quantity demanded of luxury goods. So what value does that give us? That gives us a positive 3 XCD value. And now let's look at these XCD values, sorry, not XCD value, YED values, and which one, and there's only one positive one here, and that means D would actually be the answer. So the rule is basically greater than 1 YED value is a luxury good, between 0 and positive 1, this for example, this would be a necessity good or a normal good. Just like we were speaking here, so like I said, an increase in incomes isn't going to massively increase the demand for necessity goods, it might slightly. And then if YD is negative, there's also an other distinction as well. So YED, so negative YED means it's an inferior good. So what actually is an inferior good? If you remember back to the definition, when incomes rise, demand falls, and when incomes fall, demand rises. So for example, it's like buying Asda branded baked beans instead of like Heinz baked beans. And of course, these two would be examples of inferior goods due to the negative YED. Moving on to the next question. So it looks like we have a diagram question, 4 marks here. So draw the short run profit maximizing equilibrium of a loss-making luxury brownie baker, and small local bakeries have many characteristics of monopolistic competition. So loss-making monopolistic competition diagram. And remember, monopolistic competition is the exact same diagram as a monopoly diagram. So that's a very easy one to remember. So let's get started with labeling up the axes. So it's price here. You can put cost revenue. It is technically a cost revenue diagram, but price also works. I think quantity on your y-axis. And then let's get started with the curves. But the main thing here, so what is going to be how do we show that it's loss making? Remember, it's profit maximizing, but we show it's loss making by AC has to be above our AR curve. So usually I draw AR, MR, but to show it's loss making, I'm going to draw the AC first just to make sure it's above. So nice and high AC, and just make sure the only thing you need to do is make sure your AR does not touch your AC, and it will mean that is loss making. So something like this, so D equals AR, then just your MR, and then just your simple normal curves, MR, so your marginal revenue curve, MC, and still remember the same rule applies. Your MC still needs to intersect AC at its lowest point, so something like that, but let's actually draw it out. So MC curve, and yeah, so now that's pretty much all the curves done. Now let's add on the points as asked us to do, which is the profit maximizing point. So where do we profit maximize? We profit maximize where MC equals MR, which is at this point here. Then what do you do from MC equals MR? You go up to your AR curve, and this will give you a profit maximizing price. So we go from MC equals MR, we go up, and this will now tell us our profit maximizing price, so P max. But now what do we need to still do? We need to find our costs. So how do we find our costs? We keep going up from that price. So we go from Q, so we'll go down, just label this Q max, but you keep going up from Q max until you hit your AC curve, and this will now tell us the costs. So now until we hit our AC curve, and now we go left. And now what does this box tell us? If usually this box would tell us something like super low profit, since our price is now here and our costs are here, what does this box tell us? This box is therefore telling us the losses we're making, since our costs are higher than our price. So if your costs are higher than your selling price, of course, for every single unit you sell, you are making a loss. And I'm just going to tell that to the examiner, of course. I'm going to say a loss and I'm going to just label it up like that. And that is all you would have to do to pick up those 4 marks. What are the main things here? What you're getting assessed on? Of course, your axes, then your curves. So making sure you've drawn the four curves, labeling your curves, and then the main thing here, because it's loss making, your AC just needs to be above your AR curve, and then of course just showing the box. And this is an example of a 4-mark question. You can literally get done in, if you've practiced enough, pretty much 30 seconds. A loss-making monopolistically competitive market diagram is one of the simplest questions you can get, and especially 4 marks. It's a blessing. And the main thing is, if you spend 30 seconds on this, you have a 3-minute 30 surplus for maybe your section B, your section C, and it's all about trying to be as efficient as possible in section A, meaning that in the later sections maybe you'll have a bit more extra time. Question 3 done, 5 marks bagged, and let's move on to question 4. So question 4, let's have a read of this. So with reference to the information provided, calculate percentage change. Your calculate question, 2 marks, in the price of an annual season ticket. And what is it giving us here? The annual season ticket for a train journey between London and Reading is planned to increase from 5,000 to 5,664. So we're calculating the percentage change in the price of an annual ticket. So how would we do that? Okay, so how would we calculate this? Of course, very simple percentage change. I've been asked to not spend too long on these since they're very easy questions. But of course, you'd calculate the change. What is a percentage change formula? You calculate the change on the top, and then you divide it by the original, which is 5,044 in this scenario, and times it by 100, which will give us our answer, which gives the answer of 12.3%. And let's move on to the second part of this question. So it's an explain question, and it's holding 2 marks. So explain the likely impact of an increase in the price of the season ticket on consumer surplus. So it's just referring to the increase in the price referred to here. So very simply, what is going to happen when prices increase with regards to consumer surplus? There's going to be a decrease in consumer surplus. I remember these 2 marks, so this is not enough for both marks. We need an explanation here. So decrease in consumer surplus as the gap between what consumers are willing to pay and the equilibrium market price will fall. So consumer surplus is essentially the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay. So if prices increase, it just means that consumer surplus is now smaller. Why? Since there's less individuals in that gap. And of course you can show it on a diagram here, and you could probably pick up both marks by showing it on a diagram, but it is a bit easy just writing out this simple definition. And that would be enough for the 2 marks, and let's move on to the last mark of this question. So it's a diagram question, and it's multiple choice. So which of the following areas represent the change in producer surplus? This is a good one. When a minimum price is imposed. So first thing to identify is where is the minimum price? Well, it actually shows you in this question, so that doesn't matter. And yeah, let's have a shot at this. Okay, let's start really simply. So it's asking us for the change in producer surplus when a minimum price is introduced. But where is the original surplus? The original surplus. So let's forget the minimum price, just the original surplus at equilibrium. So at E. So the original producer surplus, remember, is below the equilibrium price. So it would be this triangle here, this red triangle I've labelled, and that is the original producer surplus. Now, what is happening with regards to price? With the minimum price, the price is obviously increasing from PE to P1, so producer surplus is in fact going to increase. And where's the new area of producer surplus? It's basically this entire area now, basically the larger triangles below the minimum price. And remember, the question is asking us, very keyword, it's asking us the change in the producer surplus. So let's see which of these fit this category now. So FEP P1, so let's find FE, I do not know where E is. Yeah, where is he? Okay, FEPE P1. So that is saying this triangle here, that is in fact wrong. So yeah, so it definitely would not be here. And just for a bit of revision, what does FEPE P1 actually represent? It represents the change in consumer surplus, as before the equilibrium price is set, consumer surplus was this entire triangle, but then after the minimum price has been set, the consumer surplus has now decreased to that. So that was the change. So FEPP1, this is the change in consumer surplus after the minimum price. And then, so it's not A, so what is B? B is FM, where is M? I have no idea. FMP1. So that is, of course, so what does this represent, like we were just saying? FMP1 represents the consumer surplus after the minimum price has been implemented, which of course does not fit our criteria. And then we have C, which is PE, P1, which is exactly what we are looking for if you look at this now, since the question is asking us a change in the producer surplus when the minimum price is imposed, and this, in fact, this new area would be the change in the producer surplus, which is, so we're going to tick this and that would be the answer. But just for practice sakes, let's check the last one out. So then we have G, where is G? So G, I can't actually see the answer. So G, K, and P1. This is the entire triangle, and of course the main thing here is exam technique, looking at the wording. A lot of students probably did mess up on that, but the question is asking you for the change in the producer surplus, not the entire new triangle. So that would be the entire new producer surplus, and C, the right answer, would show us the change in the producer surplus. And that would be hard to get 5 out of 5 marks on question 4. Let's move on to question 5, which has a big graph. And let's see what it's asking us. So which of the following is the ratio, so asking a ratio, of public sector pay relative to private sector pay in 2022? So it's asking us in 2022, and let's have a look at this. So we have 118, which is, so public sector to private sector is 114 to 118. So how do you convert this into a ratio? So 114 would be the 1, and then what would 118 be? Of course 118 is larger than 114, so what would we do? We do 118 divided by 114, which would give us 0.13, which would be our 35, which would be our answer. So of course, doing 118 divided by 114 would give us 0.35, which you round up to 0.4, which means the answer would be in fact B. And let's move on to the next part of the question. So it's a 4-mark question, which it looks quite big. So using the information provided and the concept of a monopsony, explains in an explain question why nurses in the public sector have lower wage rises than those in the private sector. So straight away, sounds like a very simple, just monopsony theory question. And let's have a look at the STEM. Over 90%, and this would obviously, like we always say, 1 mark reserved for application here. So you would obviously use that to get that 1 application mark. So over 90% of nurses work in the public sector. So 90% in the public sector. Nurses in the public sector have experienced wage rises lower than those in the private sector over the last 10 years. Okay, so I've defined a monopsony as one dominant buyer of labour in the market, and then I've given an example of the NHS. Of course, nurses in the public sector are employed by the NHS. And why do they have lower wage rises than those in the private sector? A big thing with this question is 4 marks in section A. Don't go too off topic. Don't go on to explain now, because if this was a 25-mark question, you'd probably go on to explain monopsonies have monopsony power. They use this monopsony power to exploit the workers with low wages, and you can explain that whole chain of analysis. But the question is specifically asking you why they have lower wage rises, and just try to be as focused to the question as possible, as you can write lots of chain of analysis about monopsonies, but in this question, there's only going to be around 1 to 2 marks to chains of analysis. So you need to keep that in mind. Remember, these questions are usually structured, the 4-mark questions, 2 knowledge, 1 application, and 1 analysis. So you need to make sure you're hitting those points and not just writing chains of analysis for the sake of it. Okay, so here I've just written, this means nurses have no other choice in the public sector, as there's no other firms to work for, so they have to expect their low wage rises. So that's pretty much a mark there, just explaining. And then I've picked up the 1 application mark, because of course this was an example, but the application mark you're going to pick up is going to be from this. So I literally just quoted it explicitly. Energy public sector experiences lower wage rises in the last 10 years than the private sector. So then I'm just going to finish off with 1 sentence on the private sector, just explaining why the private sector wage rises are higher, since of course, unlike the public sector where it's a monopsony, in the private sector there are multiple firms, so they have to be competitive, and one way they are competitive is wage rises. So I've just finished off by saying, however, in the private sector there are multiple firms, meaning to remain competitive in relation to other firms, they must offer pay rises. And that would be more than enough for 4 out of 4 marks there. The main thing I want to tell you to remember here is to remember the mark breakdown. 2 knowledge, 1 application, and 1 analysis. Do not just go on a rant with your chain of analysis. Like, we understand you will probably have that content knowledge, but it's not going to pick you up the marks. It's a waste of time. Remember, it's all about being efficient. But yeah, let's move on to the next part of this question, which is done. So that is section A done, and that's 5 out of 5 marks. And that is a quick little tutorial how to get 25 out of 25 on your 2023 paper 1 microeconomics. Moving on to section B, let's get right on with it and let's go straight to the 5-mark question. Okay, so 6A, 5 marks. Let's see what it looks like. So with reference to figure 1, so we're going to use figure 1 here. Explain question, the market structure that best describes the market for UK online streaming services. So let's have a look at figure 1 and let's see if that helps us decide what market structure this is. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have 6 large firms. What is this screaming? This is clearly screaming an oligopoly. So how are we going to pick up 5 marks here? I'm probably going to work out the 6 firm concentration ratio for application. So you're gonna have a few knowledge marks, application mark. That should concentration ratio should get you the application mark, and then just explaining why this is an oligopoly. Few large firms dominate the market, and then just explanation. So since we're on the figure, let's just start by calculating the 6 firm concentration ratio. I'm just going to use Q2 of 2021. Basically, all we have to do here, just add them all together, and that would give me 88.2. So that is what I'm going to write. But yeah, let's get started with this question. Let's get started answering it. So this is the how I'm answering it. So first, I'm just telling them the market structure. Market structure is an oligopoly. I'm going to then give the application E.G. The 6 firm concentration ratio is 88.2%. And of course, I do need to in fact mention when that 6 firm concentration ratio was. I think it was June, so Q2 of 2021. And now I'm just going to explain why it is an oligopoly. So an oligopoly market is characterized by a few large firms who dominate the market, and of course the concentration ratio does prove that. And here, if you think about the mark breakdown, identification is going to be 1 mark. The 6 firm concentration ratio is going to be 1 to 2 marks. So I'm going to say 2 to 3 marks here, and then this will be 1 mark now, the analysis. So I'm on around 4 marks overall. So I'm just going to add, since the last marks are going to be analysis marks, I'm just going to add general oligopoly, a bit of general oligopoly chain of analysis, just to make sure I'm 100% scoring the 5 marks here. And that is pretty much all I'd write. So these firms are, so just to carry on the general analysis, these firms are price makers due to their large market share, which is attributed to the extremely high barriers to entry, e.g. economies of scale set up by incumbent firms. So basically the price makers, and the reason why they can be price makers is because they have high barriers to entry. And yeah, that's all you need for that 5 mark question. Quite nice, quite a simple 5 mark question. Let's move on to the next question, which is a 10 marker. So with reference to information provided, so this is quite general, so you might actually have to read all the extracts here, but assess whether Netflix subscribers behave rationally. Now that is a good question. Okay, let's get on with answering the 10 marker. So why Netflix subscribers behave rationally? What does it actually mean to behave rationally? It means consumers make decisions to maximize their utility, and that's the main thing. And let's have a look at the extracts to find which one is relevant with regards to behavior rationality. So education websites and TV programs, probably not. Economics price discrimination, probably not. How Netflix makes use of behavioural science, sounds very relevant. Let's have a read of this. Because it talks a bit about nudging, autoplay, so that could lead to irrational behaviour. The consumers could become addicted if you think about it. So binge watching, things like that, so that's maybe a bit of a hint. Okay, so if you look at this third paragraph now, so it talks about consumers worried about the rising cost of living and they are turning back on their subscription to Netflix. So what does that tell you? Does that signify rational or irrational behaviour? So consumers realise that, for example, the cost of petrol, cost of food is rising, and so they're prioritising essentials over something that is not essential like Netflix. So that definitely does show they are making decisions to maximise their utility, which does show rational consumers. Then it gives you a few stats on how that is happening, another 2 million forecast. Yep, so basically what it's saying here, especially towards the end, is in lockdown, so 2022, 2021, most people were home due to lockdown. But now, since people are going back to work, they're not spending as much time at home, therefore they don't really need this Netflix subscription, since they're not using it as much, which is 100% rational. And then we have a bit about Disney Plus and how it has higher satisfaction rates. But remember, with your 10 mark question, unless it explicitly asks for 2 paragraphs, you can 100% get away with 1 paragraph. Remember, so 6 KA marks and the 4 evaluation marks. So this is how I would work. This is how I do the paragraph. So first, start by just defining rationality. So like I said, it's where consumers are utility maximizing. And then my main paragraph, my topic point would just be, I believe consumers are acting rationally as they are cancelling their subscriptions. I would then, so my paragraph structure is also state your point, application, then analysis. I would then go on to give a bit of application, maybe give a few stats. Remember, there are obviously 2 application marks here, and then go on to explain basically what I was saying, why consumers, and explain why this shows its rationality. So why consumers are cancelling their subscription. So things like they're going back to work, they're spending less time at home, and then so if they're spending less time on Netflix, they don't get as much value out of the subscription, therefore they're cancelling the subscription. Or that consumers, due to the cost of living crisis, they don't have enough, they don't have much as much disposable income, thus they would rather prioritise spending on necessities, things like food, water and rent, rather than spending on more of a luxury good like Netflix. Thus they're substituting away from Netflix, and that is obviously a rational utility maximising decision. And that would be more than enough for your 6 marks of analysis. Remember, these 10 marks are really simple. You get them done in a question, just make sure you're hitting the market points. So 2 knowledge, 2 application, 2 analysis. Okay, and then we have 4 marks of evaluation. You can literally get away with 1 or 2 maximum evaluation points. Remember, it's all about timing. Here, there's some quite a few good evaluation points. Remember, it's all about this behavioural economics, this behavioural thinking. And if you look back to the start of it, firstly, we talk about binge watching TV shows. You can talk about, however, now of course there are 4 marks of evaluation here, and how would I evaluate? So of course try to evaluate using the extract, and if you remember back to the start of this extract, it talks about binge watching, basically talks about consumers getting addicted, and you could say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the rationality of consumers, depends on how addicted they are. Due to features like autoplay and binge watching, could mean that consumers become addicted to Netflix, thus meaning that of course they're not going to cancel their subscription, even though it might not maximise their utility, even though there is a cost of living crisis. As they're addicted to this good, they may have an inelastic demand towards it, thus meaning they may not act rationally. Or even more specifically, to do with behavioural sciences, behavioural economics, is habitual behaviour. So consumers, as it mentions here, in lockdown, since we were home more, we were consuming more Netflix, more of these streaming services. But due to habitual behaviour, as consumers have picked up this habit, they may continue doing this habitual behaviour, continue doing this habit, and that is obviously irrational. It does not maximise utility, thus meaning, and it works as a really good evaluation point. So 2 evaluation points there. As long as you write them in enough detail, that is more than enough for those 4 evaluation marks. And this is what I'm trying to emphasise. This is how simple it is to score 10 marks on these questions. Just make sure you use the extract, simple chains of analysis, and all you need is 1 paragraph here, 1 to 2 evaluation points, and that is it. And that's all you need for 10 mark questions, and move on. Moving on to 6C, which is an 8 mark question. Let's get right on with this. So with reference to the information provided, so it hasn't given us any specific extract here, examine the likely numerical value of the cross-elasticity of demand between the UK online streaming services. So what is cross-elasticity of demand? Cross-elasticity of demand is of course XED. And XED is of course percentage change in quantity demanded of good A divided by percentage change in price of good B. And what does that mean? Is how much quantity demanded changes of one good in response to a change in the price of another good. Now, this question's been very general. It's saying with reference to all the extracts, basically. So with reference to the information provided. But like I always say, with these, with section B and these extract questions, a lot of the time, the answer is actually quite simple, and you should be able to just know it from your own knowledge, maybe from your own economics theory, but just your own experience living in the real world. And if you recall for this 8 mark question, you have 6 KA marks, or 2K, 2 application, 2 analysis, and then you have 2 evaluation marks. So that will pick you up at least 1 of the knowledge marks. But now let's actually answer the question. So what is the likely XED value between these streaming services, so between like Netflix, Disney Plus? I always say this, but a lot of these section B questions, you can answer them just with your own knowledge you have in your brain, basically, with your own economics theory, with your own just reading the news, application, just your own real world understanding. Let's think about this. So XED value, this again, it relies a bit on your content knowledge. What are the 2 things that it can be? So your XED value either tells you pretty much if it's a complement versus if it's a substitute. Now, if we think, are these substitutes or the complements? It's a very simple answer. People will subscribe to Disney Plus instead of Netflix. Why? Because Disney Plus might have some shows that Netflix doesn't, or they might like Disney Plus more. They both offer the same thing, thus they are substitutes. And now this relies on your content knowledge. If they are substitutes, what is that XED value going to be? What is the numerical XED value going to be? And if they are substitutes, the numerical XED value is going to be greater than 0. And now, even without looking at the extracts, That is some very simple knowledge that you should be able to drive straight from the question, just from using your own knowledge. And again, it's all relies on that backbone of having a solid foundation of content knowledge. So the way I do this 8-mark question, 2k marks, secure them straight away, this formula, and then your other one would just be explaining what XCD actually means. So it measures the change in quantity demanded in response to a change in price of good B. So change in quantity demanded of good A compared to, in response to a change in the price of good B. Then your application marks. How are you going to pick up these application marks? Now this is where, of course, for your section B, you will have to use your extract. So let's just have a scan through the extracts. This is probably not going to be very relevant for this. Economics of price discrimination, probably not going to be very relevant. This is probably it, but for this question, basically, we look for a stat or a figure. So, of course, we have quite a few here. And yeah, so this is talking about market share. And how can we use this to prove their substitutes? So we can use this to prove their substitutes if market share of one increases or decreases. So if the market share of Netflix decreased and by like 1%, and then the market share of Disney increased by 1% in that same time period, that shows consumers are moving from Netflix to Disney Plus, thus their substitutes. So if we find any sort of close relation like that, that'll be a great bit of application. So even straight away, if we look at Netflix and Disney Plus, Netflix lost about 4.5% of market share, and what happened in that same time period for Disney? Disney gained 1.7% of market share. And there's many examples. I'm sure there's better example here. So 5.5% Netflix lost, Disney gained around 2.3. So yeah, they're definitely substitutes. As I said, when one loses, the other one gains. And if you remember back to the previous questions, we looked through this extract, and this mentions a bit of, it proves why they're substitutes. So here it talks about declining satisfaction, declining value for money for Netflix, and then here it talks about Disney, higher satisfaction rates, rankings, then Netflix across shows, more original content. So just yet again, any one of those, and this is the main stat I would use, by the way, for this question, to pick up those 2 application marks. Just show when Disney Plus's market share is increased, when Netflix market share is decreasing, we see an increase in Disney's market share. So it shows consumers are moving from Netflix to Disney Plus. And that would be my 2 application marks, just like I said, adding those stats and figures. How would we get those 2 analysis marks then? It's just explaining what substitutes are, using the application we've just given and explaining what that means, basically. That when consumers go away from Netflix, they go towards Disney Plus. And you can even use that extract. So you can talk about how demand changes. As consumers are not as satisfied with Netflix, therefore thus decrease the quantity demanded on Netflix. And since Disney Plus provides a better service, better value in the eyes of consumers increase the quantity demanded of Disney Plus. Thus, it does show that substitute relationship. And that's literally how simple the 8-mark question is. Of course, we still need to go through evaluation, but 6k marks, so easy, and you can be so time efficient with this as well. So you need to, it's just a banker. It's the bank question where you need to bank it. You need to make sure you're getting 8 out of 8 on this question. So with evaluation here, it's 2 marks. Just be simple, straightforward. Not much development needed here. First one that comes to my mind is just another content knowledge point. Like I say, content knowledge mastery is key. This is why I emphasize so much in my live classes. But how am I picking up these 2 marks? So a really good point is it depends on the XCD value itself. Yes, we've proven that the XCD value is greater than 0, but again, content knowledge is key here. There's degrees of the substitutes as well. For example, if the XCD value is 0.2, what does this indicate? This indicates they are weak substitutes. Whereas if the XCD value is something like 0.8 or like 0.7, whatever you want to call it, they are stronger substitutes. So however in evaluation, this depends on the value of the XCD, as although they are substitutes, it depends whether they are weak or strong substitutes. And what I would actually do, just to add that little icing on the cake, is when we talked about the differences in the market share. So we said, for example here, where Netflix fell 4.5%, but Disney did not gain 1.7%, it indicates that they are actually quite weak substitutes rather than strong substitutes. So it indicates a lower XCD value maybe, and that's a really, really good evaluation point. And it's a lot more than you need for 2 marks, but you can pretty much write that down in a minute as well. And like I said, strong content knowledge, knowing how to evaluate, bing bang bosh, that is 8 out of 8 marks, box. So 12 marker, with the reference to extract C, so giving us a specific extract, we love to see that. Discuss the likely private and external benefits. So as soon as I read that, what am I thinking about? That big topic, the second biggest topic in Edexcel economics, the second highest yield topic in Edexcel economics, which is market failure, of course. Discuss the likely private and external benefits of viewing educational websites and TV programs. Okay, so taking a deeper dive into this, so it's talking about the private and external benefits. If it's talking about the private and external benefits, and we know it's talking about market failure, And again, it's a 12-mark question. What am I thinking? Firstly, it's private external, because it's benefits, it's definitely something to do with positive externalities. And positive externalities has a diagram, doesn't it? So that is probably how I'm going to, definitely going to include this in this question. It's basically, it's telling you to include it without explicitly stating it. So discuss the private external benefits, so basically a positive externality diagram, of viewing educational websites and TV programs. Now, let's just break this down into private and external benefits. So what is the difference between the private and external benefits? So if you think about the price mechanism, of course, again, it's just content knowledge, but private benefits are basically just benefits to the person themselves, so the GCSE student who's consuming the content, and then external benefits are the benefits to the whole of society. So what are the private benefits? Why would you go, it's like why are you watching this video? It's literally a perfect example, but the private benefits of you watching this video is, we'll say in terms of A-level economics, you will get better grades. So you will get better grades. What does better grades mean? Why do you want better grades? Ultimately, let's think about like the overarching goal. So you want better grades. Why? Because you probably want to go to a good university, a good apprenticeship. But overarchingly, you want to have a good job that makes good money. So you want better grades to increase income. But now let's think about the benefits to society of you becoming more educated. If you are more educated, there's lots of benefits to society. Like firstly, educated people, it lowers crime rates. Since if you're educated, you're less likely to throw your life away and go kill someone, because you understand the ramifications. You have a career, you probably have a family that you know that maybe you have to provide for. So you're less likely to do stupid things. You're less likely to hurt people. Thus, it means that lower crime rates. That's why we see lower crime rates in developed countries rather than less developed countries. Then just the more simple things. If you're more educated, you will probably make your future employer more money. So, but let's go even before that. By becoming more educated, what does educated mean? You have more skills. If you have more skills, you can talk about like human capital, and with better human capital, you're more productive. So, increased productivity. And if you're more productive, and everyone that goes to university, everyone that becomes educated is more productive, it means we have a higher skilled workforce, or just a more productive workforce. And of course here, you would obviously have to pick up your application marks. So let's have a look at extract C, which is this extract. So education websites and TV programs. Let's just find anything that backs up basically the benefits of these programs. So firstly, they're free. That means, I guess, what does free mean? If you think about demand, it means that if you think about the inverse relationship of price and quantity demanded, it means that of course there's gonna be a lot more demand due to price being free. Therefore, what do we usually say when price? Just think about it in the way, because free. I remember when this came out, this paper, it confused a lot of students, because if price drops from £2 to £1, what do we usually say? We say that consumers are better off. Why? Consumer surplus increases. It's literally the exact same thing. If things are free, there's a massive increase in consumer surplus, since it doesn't cost every single consumer is going to be experiencing surplus. So yeah, that's definitely one point you could also talk about. A private benefit is that consumer surplus increases. But yeah, what else does this say? So they're written by teachers and subject experts. So I guess well, like it says, it's more reliable, and yeah, the government are investing into it. So Orc National Academy, and obviously, honestly, I've never heard of that, but I've heard of Bite Size, but never Orc National Academy. But ministers have set aside 43 million to fund it. I think they should fund 43 million for my economics videos. But yeah, the application is a bit simple here. There's not really much that jumps out to you. But yeah, it's again, you have to basically use your own, like we planned here. You need to use a bit of your own thinking, and these will just basically get you the application marks. But like I said, we would be drawing a big diagram here, so which is some of you may know it as just the positive externality diagram. Technically, it is a positive consumption externality diagram, but it doesn't really matter, whatever you call it. So let's get started with drawing this. So of course, a positive consumption externality, supply equals marginal private costs, and since we're talking about the benefits, we're talking about private and external benefits, and this would also equal marginal social costs, since we're not focusing on the costs here. Now we have our demand curve, so demand equals marginal private benefit. So that means now, remember, this point here is our market equilibrium. But since in positive consumption externalities, the external benefit is greater than the private benefit, we have another curve which is our marginal social benefits. And now let's get this labelled up. So let's get these points labelled up. So what does this represent? This is QSE. So of course, where marginal social benefit curve intersects our marginal social cost, we call that the social equilibrium. So let's get that labelled up. And then what is this black point? This black point, of course, represents QE, which is just the it's just the market equilibrium. But what is the theory behind this positive consumption externality diagram? So we have the market equilibrium, which is of course here, and we have the socially efficient equilibrium, which is QSE. But why is there a discrepancy between these? And this is again just content knowledge, since consumers will consume at the market equilibrium. So without government intervention, we will consume here. And why do consumers consume here? And let's use the education example. When you're in school, maybe when you're doing your A-level economics, you are only thinking about, yet again, your private benefits of better grades. Maybe that will get you into better university and therefore a better income later on. But that's the problem. As a consumer, you only think about your private benefits. And the big thing you don't think about are the external benefits. You don't think about the benefits to society of you getting more educated, thus meaning you underconsume education. So you only think about your better grades, but if you thought about the vast variety of benefits to society, like lower crime rate, like we've written here, increased productivity, better skilled workforce, more tax revenue for the government, etc., etc., you would consume education more. Thus, this is why there's this gap of the triangle of welfare loss, which is of course just here. Share that in. This represents the potential welfare gain if consumers consume more. Like for example, that is a prime reason why there is a minimum age of leaving education. For example, you're legally not allowed to leave education below 16, and this is because if you do leave education before 16, before you're 11, the government knows there's massive loss in that potential welfare gain. Where if you became more educated, like let's just think, a student who leaves before completing his GCSEs versus a student who goes on to complete a university degree, who is more likely to commit a crime? There's a massive opinion that it's going to be the person who's left before doing his GCSEs, because probably had a tough upbringing, probably a harsher background. But this is the reason why the government wants to promote these individuals to consume more education, become more educated, as with more experience in like the workplace, surrounded by professionals, they're more likely to become a professional themselves, thus increasing outcomes for society. But just a tip again for all these externality diagrams. How do you work out where this welfare loss triangle is? You go from your market equilibrium. What is your market equilibrium? Where supply equals demand. So where do these two intersect? Let's go down from supply, and this is where demand is. So from the market equilibrium here, you go up or down to your socially efficient curve. And where's the socially efficient curve here? The curve here is above, so you go up, and now that is your welfare loss triangle. And only other things I would label on this is the gap between these two. What does that represent? It represents the under consumption, because like I said, consumers underconsume education, for example. Okay, so breaking this down into paragraph per paragraph. So for this first paragraph, of course, split into private versus external benefits. So how would I word this? The likely private benefits of viewing educational websites and TV programs is that it will lead students to have better grades, thus reaching their overarching goals of better income. Then I would go to the extracts. Let's try to find something that backs this up. Monthly visitors. Then just explain how this happens. So the private benefits can be seen are where demand equals margin private benefit. So basically the free market equilibrium, you can even label that on if you want. Free, I'm sure free market, FME, obviously write it in your exam, free market equilibrium. But this can be seen at the free market equilibrium as when consumers consume more of these free educational content, they're likely to learn more. If you learn more, they like to score better in their exams, therefore receive better grades. And it means that with better grades, this a bit of a chain of analysis of how the pathway to university works. They go to better universities, better apprenticeships, so end up earning better, higher income. And then you can justify why it is a private benefit, as consumers that are consuming this good are benefiting directly from the consumption, because the students themselves are benefiting from consuming the good. I would probably do this is, I think you can speak a lot more about the diagram in the second paragraph, so I'm going to make a massive second paragraph, but the first one might be a bit less theory based. Now, with regards to evaluation, this question is slightly dull for, well, this part of the question, the private benefits, is slightly dull for evaluation, but let's just think about it. So we're saying that there's lots of benefits of students consuming education online. But what actually happens, think about yourself. So you're watching this A-level economics video on YouTube. What can sometimes happen when you're actually watching A-level economics videos and you look at your suggestions? You might see like a KSI video and you might click on that, so you may become distracted. Or a lot of times, even though on this channel there's pretty much everything you need for an A star, have you gone through the entirety of this channel? No, because there's, you can say, compared to like your school, there's a lack of structure. and you don't have enough motivation. It relies a lot on your personal motivation to go through all the videos, to pay attention to all the videos, for example. So a great evaluation point saying you can even talk about the addiction of these, the PED values, or the addictive nature of these electronic goods. So however, in evaluation, the degree of the private benefits depends on the addictive nature of electronic devices, as due to like YouTube or these websites they're consuming this education on, they may become distracted, they may have a lack of motivation, thus reducing the degree or reducing the benefits of reducing the potential of the private benefits. Another one, a bit more of a technical one, is to do with the diagram itself, and it's to do with how hard it is to actually measure these welfare gains or these welfare losses in cases of negative externalities. But in reality, these students are consuming these websites and they may be getting better grades, but there's no tangible way to measure that. There's no tangible way to measure the students who are getting better grades due to consuming the website, or maybe students are getting worse grades due to consuming the website. There's no way to measure the benefits, the private benefits, and the external benefits. So it's a bit weird. It's hard to quantify it. Okay, and for the second paragraph, the external benefits paragraph, I would word it something like, I believe the likely external benefits of viewing educational websites and TV programs are several benefits such as increased productivity, better skilled workforce, and things like a lower crime rate. Give a bit of application from the extract, basically whatever you didn't use last time, anything you want to use, but anything to back it up. And then how would my chain of analysis go? I'd probably just actually kick off by using a bit more of the diagram, because I want to include a lot of diagram theory here. And by the way, when I was labeling the diagram, I forgot one label, which is of course the external benefit. It's just a gap between your marginal private benefit curve and your marginal social benefit curve. But how would I word this? I would probably say something like consumers underconsume, like the thing I said before. They underconsume at the market equilibrium, thus leading to they miss out on the potential welfare gain at the socially efficient equilibrium. As if we consume at the socially efficient equilibrium, for example, more people become educated, it means that there's better human capital, better skilled workforce, and basically just leading to all this. Means workers are more productive. If workers are more productive, it makes firms more money. That obviously has benefits in themselves. You can basically go a million routes here. If workers are more productive, they're more skilled. They can provide more for their family, better living conditions. The government has more money, they can invest, etc. There's basically a million things you can say. With more education, lower crime rates, better living conditions, again, better living standards, just good stuff. And with regards to evaluation for this question, for this side of it, for this paragraph, I would probably say something like time lag works really well here. However, it depends on how the external benefits depend on the time frame. As in the short run, it's going to take a long time for the external benefits to be translated into society. Why? If you improve the level of education of GCSE students or even primary school students, it's going to take nearly 20 years for you to see something like increased productivity, lower crime rates. As, for example, if a student's in their SATs, they are like, I don't know, 10. And by the time they get a job, they become established, maybe buy a house, they're about 30. So it takes about 20 years there, or whatever time period you can say. It takes a long time, basically, to see these external benefits. So you can say, however, it depends on the time frame. Or time frame, instead of using time frame, you could say, depends on time lag. Another valuation point is, of course, classic opportunity cost. Spent 43 million on online services. If we just reinvest that into some normal in-person schooling, maybe it would actually lead to better benefits, a better society outcome. Now, a classic thing I get with Edexcel Section B in my live classes is that students don't feel satisfied in their answers. They don't feel like they're hitting enough economics marks. And it's just kind of how Section B goes in Edexcel Economics. They don't actually ask you that many deep theory questions, besides sometimes a 15 marker. Sometimes it's actually quite a good theory question. But your only usual big theory questions are the 25 mark questions, where you really can show the examiner how much you know about economics. As a lot of these questions, they literally just scratch the surface. They want you to show a bit about it, but you don't really need that much. And it annoys a lot of students, but just for the students who may be thinking that, just don't worry and you'll be fine. Moving on to the 15 mark question. So using examples from figure 2 or extract B, so it's given us 2 to refer to, discuss the likely impact of price discrimination on a firm's profits. Use relevant diagrams. Now, the reason why I laughed there is this is an absolute classic question and great for revision. As look through past papers, wherever this is assessed, it's always the same question. price discrimination can pretty much be only assessed in one way. There's slight variations of how they word it, but the key theory they're assessing you on is exactly the same. So once you've got this 15 marker boxed, you've got like a model answer for it, you're perfect. And if you get this in the exam, you should be laughing. You should be very happy, since it's a very good question to get and a really easy one to get full marks on, since it's literally the same question, slightly reworded whenever it comes up. Let's get started with what price discrimination actually is. It's where firms charge different groups of consumers different prices for the same product. And that just exemplifies the entirety of price discrimination. Now, and the question is asking us, what are the impacts of price discrimination on a firm's profits? And this is all, again, it's all economics theory, but it leads back to the classical economic assumption, which is what? Firms are profit maximizers, and a way they can further that objective, a way they can make more profit, is by price discriminating. So why do they do it? It increases the firm's profits. So that is basically answering the question, what is the likely impact of price discrimination? The likely impact is that will increase a firm's profits. But then, this is how you pick up the 15 marks, you're proving how that happens, how price discrimination increases a firm's profits. And the best way to do that, and this is why I said, once you know this model answer, you can pretty much smash any single price discrimination question, is using the diagrams. So this is a bit unique. They have a bit of a weird, it's a bit of a unique one, is how I'm going to call it. You have 3 diagrams you need to draw here, and we will do a bit of an explanation for each of these. So the diagrams themselves are very simple, but they help explain very well the theory. So let's get started. So I'm going to label 1 elastic, 1 inelastic, and 1 total. So whenever I teach price discrimination in my live classes, the easiest way to do it is the UK's example of train tickets. So as you know, as you might know, is train tickets in the UK, there's 2 different prices. They both get the exact same experience, the exact same good. You're both just going on the train. Nothing is different. Besides, under 16s and over 16s pay different prices. So it perfectly fits that definition. Different groups of consumers, so there's 2 groups here. There is under 16s, over 16s, different prices for the same product. And like we said, why do firms price discriminate? Because it increases firms' profits. So let's try to prove why this works. So if we think about under 16s, these are usually students. These individuals have, the easiest way to put it, they have less money. And since they have less money, very simply, they are charged by train firms lower prices. And what's the economics behind this? And what's the economics behind price discrimination? The way firms group consumers is based on their PEDs, is based on the elasticities of demand. And for example, in under 16s, they 100% have elastic demand. And what does elastic demand mean? It means consumers are very responsive to changes in price. As if you imagine you're a student, some of you can probably imagine this. Your parents give you £2.30 each day for the train ticket. Now, if one day that train ticket went up to £2.50 since the train line increased the price, you literally only have £2.30. Thus, it means you're a very elastic demand consumer, since any sort of change in price, any increase in price, you can no longer demand that good. So it decreases your quantity demanded. And what does that mean? It means you're very responsive to a change in price, which is exactly what an elastic demand consumer is. Now, over 16s, we say they have more money. So if you think about people with jobs, maybe a 30-year-old, a 50-year-old, he won't have £2.30 in his bank, he might have 23,000 in his bank. Now, if you have more money, it means that now firms charge them a higher price. And let's break that down into the economics again. So they split groups of consumers into their elasticities. Now, these over 16s will have more inelastic demand. Why? Let's think about a scenario where one day they're on the train platform and the price is now, it's gone from £2.20 to £2.50. Since these individuals have more money, like I said, they have lots of money in their bank, the change in quantity demanded is going to be insignificant, since consumers, they're just going to pay the higher price since they can afford to pay it, since they have the money to pay it. Thus, it means, what does this mean for the train firms? So these consumers can afford to pay higher prices, so train firms charge them higher prices. So like I said, let's contrast them. That student who only has £2.30, if prices increase, he literally cannot get the train since he only has £2.30. Whereas an adult who's going to work, yeah, if the train price increase from £2.30 to £1.50, he probably won't like it, but it's not like he's not going to catch a train for that reason. So therefore, inelastic demand as why they're not very responsive to changes in price, and that is exactly what inelastic demand is. And why does this help firms make more profits? Since it means that they can keep both groups of consumers happy. So by charging £2.30, it means that the cheaper the under 16 consumers could afford it, and of course the inelastic demand consumers, the over 16s would afford it as well. Whereas this is where the problem is. By charging £2.30, yes, we have the elastic demand consumers, but we're missing this potential here. We know, and the trade firms know, they can charge these inelastic demand consumers higher prices. So they're missing out on that potential profit by splitting the consumer base into two consumers, elastic and inelastic. They can charge these under 16s £2.30, but then they can make just a bit more profit from these guys. They can maybe charge them £3, and as they know they're inelastic, they can make a bit more profit from them. So basically, by charging one price, they're not maximising the potential profit they're making from the inelastic demand consumers, thus leading to overall less profit. Okay, enough of me speaking. Let's show this on the diagram. So, how would we draw this diagram? Now, this is actually a very, very simple diagram. Once you learn it and once you understand it, you should just remember it. On your axes, it's price, quantity. You can put cost, revenue, quantity. It's fine, but so we have elastic, inelastic, and total. And like I said, total is if a firm is not price discriminating. And elastic is just how you would expect it. It's just a shallow demand curve. I think that's how you describe it. And yeah, so D equals AR. So you just draw an elastic demand curve, and then you would draw like you always do, a MR curve, which is twice as steep, and that's all you need to do for your elastic demand. And what does an elastic demand curve look like? If you think back right to the start of year 12, it's quite steep, isn't it? So this is how an elastic demand curve would look like. So D equals AR, and like I said, same thing, you would just draw an MR twice as steep. So total is the only one with a bit of variation, and like I said, it's if the firms did not price discriminate, if they charged all groups of consumers one price. I'm going to draw it out and then I'm going to explain it, but maybe just looking at it, try to see what I'm doing. So then at that point there, it juts out. And why is that? So at that point there is where the elastic demand consumers come in. Since if you look at that, it's basically there. So what we do is basically we're inelastic, because look, at this prices, there's only inelastic demand consumers. And then when we reach this point, there's now elastic demand consumers, so the point juts out. So you're inelastic, and then when you reach the point where there's elastic demand consumers, it kind of juts out and it becomes an elastic demand curve. And that's your D equals AR, and same rule follows for your MR. It's just twice as steep, and then same thing, it juts out. I think juts out's a word, I'm not actually too sure, but I'm pretty sure you get what I mean. So like I said, keep going, and then we have the elastic bit, so bang, so like that. Okay, and now what you can do is just draw a nice little horizontal line, and this would now represent, you call this MC, it's a marginal cost. So basically, like I said, we're kind of making it into cost and revenue diagram. And you can also, they do also accept, you can say MC equals AC here, which means now, well, with the MC also, you can show how the profits are, and then you can comment on the profits. So let's just focus on these. Let's focus on elastic. So just as always, MC. Also, it depends how you draw these diagrams. Like for example, on the iPad it's a bit hard to draw them. So I'll explain what I mean. But so let's just find the profit maximization point. So the price. So where would we find that? Of course, where MC equals MR. So MC is obviously this line here. But where MC equals MR, this would mean this is P max. And now this is the box super normal profit. And then let's move to inelastic. So where MC equals MR is this point. And now let's find the box of super normal profit. Bang. So super normal profit. And then P max. And then let's find the box super normal profit here. So where MC equals MR, which is at that point here. Now what you can actually do here now, as a last step, you can add a horizontal line. And now what is this going to represent? This red horizontal line is going to represent MC, and you can also say MC equals AC. So now you can show the profit maximization price, and also you can show the profit, the supernormal profit also. So how would we do this? So like we said, this is MC equals AC. So where is profit maximization is where MC equals MR. So where MC equals MR, which is at this point here, and then you go up from there and then go left, which would of course be P max. And now this would be your box of supernormal profit. And don't worry, I will explain what all these means. Then we have inelastic, and where's profit maximization? It's at that point there, and of course you follow the same rule. You go up, go left, and this is your box of supernormal profit, and then of course as your P-max price. And lastly, let's find out for total. So like I said, this is if a firm is not price discriminating. So where MC equals MR is at that point there, you go up, and this would be your box of supernormal profit and P-max. So this is the main point. So now what I'm going to try is, there's not much space to write, but A plus B. Okay, so there's a lot writing here, but I'm just going to label these boxes now. I'm going to label this A, I'm going to label this B, and I'm going to label this C. So I'm going to write A plus B is greater than C. Now, what does that mean? So this is talking about the respective boxes of supernova profit. This is stating that if a firm price discriminates, so like I said, these two diagrams show when a firm price discriminates, this shows when a firm does not price discriminate. So it's essentially saying if a firm price discriminates and charges different groups of consumers different prices, they're going to make more profit than if a firm does not price discriminate. And that is essentially your answer to the entire question. And that is how you just back that up with the theory I explained. So why is that? Since inelastic demand consumers, they're less responsive to a change in price. Therefore, as you can see, you can charge them a higher price here compared to the lower price of the elastic demand consumers. Whereas, as we can see, in total, you have to charge them basically the same price as elastic demand consumers. So you miss out on that potential gain, that potential profit that you're missing out from inelastic demand consumers, since you're not charging them a high enough price. And that is a hell of a lot of theory. Another little thing that comes to my mind in terms of KA marks and knowledge marks, one thing you can also write is just a few nice knowledge marks, is there's a few conditions for price discrimination. Well, there's 3 specific conditions for price discrimination. One of them, of course, is market power. So firm needs, it's like monopoly power basically. A firm needs to be able to change its prices without losing all its consumers. So for example, if the firm does not have enough market power and it increases its price for inelastic demand consumers, if all consumers just substitute away, of course, that's not going to help increase its profit. So the first condition is a firm needs to have a degree of market power or market share. Big one, and the second one is information. So a firm needs to actually be able to split its consumer base. So it needs to know which consumers are elastic versus inelastic demand consumers. Since they need to make sure they're charging inelastic demand consumers inelastic demand prices. So since if you charge inelastic demand consumers elastic demand prices, obviously you're not price discriminating and you're losing out on profit. But then also, and it works in evaluation, it depends how a firm splits its consumer base, as sometimes elastic demand consumers can be charged inelastic demand prices, so it worsens things like inequality. So that's also a great evaluation point. But the third and the final characteristic of price discrimination is that you need to be able to limit reselling. So for example, on trains, if an over 16 an adult was able to purchase a child's ticket and get away with it, it would obviously mean that they're not price discriminating effectively. But of course you can't do that, since if you are found doing that, you do get fined. So that is a way they limit reselling. But yeah, of course, for this question, since it's asking you to refer to figure 2 and extract B, let's have a read of extract B, is to do with price discrimination. Instead of using the train tickets example, you would just use Netflix here. So of course, this was explaining just general theory, but since it's a 50-mark question, of course you need those application marks. Remember, it's 9 marks KA here, so 3 knowledge, 3 application, 3 analysis, and then 6 evaluation. So to get those 3 application marks, you would just use the extract. So it's told you to look at extract B, and if you look at the bottom of this extract, it tells us basically the exact same example we've been talking about train tickets. It shows Amazon Prime. So students receive 50% off. So like I said, students, just because they're younger, it's literally the exact same example. The younger, they have less money for the exact same product. They get the exact same benefits of Amazon Prime. They just get charged less. So literally same example as train tickets. And even here, we see a different type of price discrimination where Netflix are splitting their consumer base between countries. So countries with higher incomes like America, UK are charged higher prices, whereas lower income countries like India are charged lower prices. 100%. Here, since you've been given extracts, do not use the train ticket example. Use the extract example. I would just do Amazon Prime. It's the easiest. It's literally exactly the same as train ticket. Moving on. So that's pretty much more than you need for the 9K marks. I've just explained it very in detail there. But so of course there's 6 evaluation marks here, and like I always say, use the extracts for evaluation. So it says figure 2 or extract B. If I'd read through extract B, it's a decent extract, but let's have a look at figure 2 here. So first thing that pops into mind here, what is the definition of price discrimination? You charge different groups of consumers different prices, but for the same product. Now, if you look at the top here, what is the difference here? So there's Ultra HD versus non-HD. But this is actually not price discrimination. Why? Because these groups of consumers are paying different prices for different products. So that's not price discrimination. Now, you could argue technically this is second degree price discrimination, but this works perfectly as an evaluation point, saying that since different, it doesn't align with the classic definition of price discrimination, since different products are offered basically. So this is not actually price discrimination. Now a great one is how we said one of the characteristics of price discrimination is you need to be able to limit reselling. So basically stopping inelastic demand consumers like over 16s paying elastic demand consumer prices. So like a adult gets a child's ticket. What's a classic thing that happens with Netflix? Does everyone pay for Netflix? Not really. Things like sharing passwords. So that you could say price discrimination incentivizes things like sharing passwords. Maybe something like a classic thing people do. They get, if students have it cheaper, they'll get like the younger cousin, their sibling to sign up for something, but they use it themselves. So you could actually say by a firm price discriminating, it's actually reducing their profits. And like I said before, even other points like it actually worsens inequality, as if they don't split their consumer base correctly, it means that elastic demand consumers are charged inelastic demand consumer prices. Now, if you look at the question, it's saying how price discrimination affects a firm's profits. But you could evaluate saying how there's many other components that will affect a firm's profits. Like for example, a massive one is going to be just the income of the country or the GDP of the country. Why? Since if national incomes are falling massively, since I think we mentioned it in a previous question. So the rationality question, since a rational consumer is going to prioritize necessities over something like Netflix, so that could have more, so the state of the economy could have more effect on a firm's profits rather than if a firm is price discriminating or not. But of course, there's lots of different points you can evaluate this 50-mark question for. We've gone through a few of them briefly, but yeah, I hope that helps with these 50-mark questions. And like I said, if this is maybe set a reminder, but a few days for your exam or just as general revision, 100% revise this price discrimination question. As this comes up, you definitely want to be prepared for it. You want to have a decent model answer where you can just almost rattle it off, as it will really help you secure those higher marks. Moving on to section C, of course, there are two 25-mark questions here. You pick one, but of course, for practice, we're going to answer both of them. And let's get started with question 7. So going straight to the question, evaluate possible methods of government intervention to control household energy bills. So it sounds like a quite good question so far. So how can the government intervene to control the household energy bills? Now, why do you want to control them? I'm guessing the stimulus is going to tell us. So the average household energy bill rose from 80% from wherever it rose from. So basically, we're trying to. So what's the question asking us now? So let's do a little plan here. So what are the methods that government can intervene to reduce household prices? First one that comes to my mind is, of course, just a maximum price. And why does the maximum price work? It puts a cap on how much these energy firms can charge consumers, thus meaning that, of course, it helps reduce that energy, the household energy bills. But let's keep brainstorming here. So how else can we reduce the household energy bill? And this question is basically, even though it's not specifically stating it, it's kind of just market failure. Like I said, second most popular topic in A-level economics. It's just strategies to basically solve market failure, but just asking it in a different way. And another great one is subsidies. Why can subsidies help reduce the household energy cost? Because it depends who we subsidise. So in this case, we could actually just subsidise the household. So if the cost is now $3,549, we can maybe subsidise households for 20%. It's like in the UK, single person households, when the energy bill crisis was happening, they would actually get a reduction in the energy bill, which is just a subsidy. Now, there are two great methods, which you pretty much write your entire 25 marker on. So just one paragraph on maximum price, really develop it. One paragraph on subsidies and really develop it. Now, if we want to think of some more points which aren't just generic, we're going to have to take a bit of a deeper dive into what the question is asking us. So it's asking us about the energy market. So if we think about the energy market, you have to use a bit of our own knowledge. How would you say the energy market is structured? Which firms occupy it? What sort of market structure do they occupy? So you can talk about arguments. Maybe it's probably, if even without a lot of knowledge on it, you probably can guess it's a bit of an oligopolistic market structure, very high barriers to entry. You could even argue things like if the government had control over the energy market, whether it would be better outcomes for households. So arguments for like privatisation. And so literally you could write a full paragraph on nationalising these energy firms. And if you look at the stimulus, it's told us that energy bills, the prices of energy have risen 80%, but it hasn't actually told us anything about the costs. So that could technically mean that these firms are just making massive super low profits. So then you could talk about how these firms are exploiting consumers, maybe with monopoly power, and they 100% do have monopoly power. So you talk about levels of regulation, so like the CMA coming in. Okay, so personally, the way I do this, probably do one paragraph on maximum price, second paragraph on subsidies, and then if I had time, like I said, a lot of this does depend on timing. I probably would do another paragraph on either one of them two. But if I didn't have enough time, you can still 100% score 25 out of 25 with two solid paragraphs and final judgment. And yeah, but how would I? So let's start with the maximum price diagram. So the way I'd start is, I believe one possible method of government intervention to control household energy prices would be by the government setting a maximum price or a price ceiling. Then, of course, like I always say, what is the paragraph structure? Point, application, analysis, and then link back to question. So then we move on to the application stage of our paragraph. Now this is where, and this is why in my live classes I emphasize and teach as much real world application as possible, as especially for these 25 mark questions, you need to have an appreciation of the real world of economics, and you will be exposed if you do not know any examples. So here, for example, I would give in 2022 the London Mayor Sadiq Khan proposed to set a maximum price on rent in the UK, in London, to stop the increases in rent prices. There's many examples of this. I think in New York, the mayor Arnold, the actor, he set a maximum price on rent, I think, also, but the one in the UK actually never happened. It was just proposed. But yeah, anyway, it's a good bit of application. And then moving on to the analysis, and the way I'd build most of the chain of analysis is, of course, around the diagram. So how do you draw a maximum price diagram? So price, quantity, what does a maximum price diagram look like? It's just simple supply, demand curve. Now let's think, where is a maximum price diagram? Where's it going to go? Is it above or below the equilibrium price? Now, a maximum price, what are you trying to do? And let's look back to the question. We're trying to reduce that price. We're trying to reduce that price below what the firms are already charging. So below this 3,000. So would a maximum price be above or below the equilibrium? Now, I might explain this every single time we do these, but you don't understand, especially even in high level students, how many students mess this up and then have to redraw it, or they just totally mess up an entire paragraph. But let's think about it. Maximum price, what we're trying to do, we're trying to reduce the price. If you're trying to reduce the price, it's going to be below the equilibrium price. Let me just level up the equilibrium here. So it's going to be below the equilibrium price, thus meaning it's going to look something like this. And we'll call that Pmax. Now this is where you develop the chain of analysis. Let's just label up the diagram. So this is going to be QS, and then this is going to be QD. So what's happening straight away? What does the gap between QS and QD represent? This represents what? It represents excess demand. Why is that? Let's think very simply. Prices have decreased from PE to Pmax, thus producers have less incentive to supply. But then if you think about the inverse relationship of demand, it means that at lower prices there's more quantity demanded. So these lower prices, consumers want more, but producers do not want to produce as much at these lower prices. Now, it depends on the sector, but in this question we're talking about energy, and of course energy is a necessity. It's a massive thing that consumers need, so it's going to be a massive problem for consumers if they cannot get energy and if there's an excess demand of energy. But that's more of a negative effect of it, and you probably would use that in evaluation. So the way I'd basically structure my analysis, just tell the examiner basically what I've said to you so far, that they would set the maximum price at the price ceiling below the equilibrium price, as they want to reduce that, and even use a bit of application here. They want to reduce the price from 3,549 to a price that's more affordable for consumers. Why does that work? Since, like I said, talk about the inverse relationship of demand at lower prices, consumers can afford to demand more. And let's think about the surpluses. If prices decrease below the equilibrium, what is going to happen to consumer surplus? Of course, consumer surplus is going to increase. And you can't actually show this on the diagram. This is not needed, but since the problem with the maximum price diagram is that it's a very simple, very straightforward diagram. So adding a few of these annotations can just elevate that level and show you that top level, that level 5 band student. So all you need to do is go from your Pmax, so at that point where your Pmax intersects the supply curve, and go vertically up from there. And then from there, once you've hit this point here, go left. Now this should mean you have 3 triangles, so one triangle here, one triangle here, and one triangle here, then 2 boxes. So 3 triangles are 2 boxes by basically just going from where supply equals your Pmax, go up and then go left. Now, what do these represent? Very simply, all these three are just consumer surplus, and this last one is specifically consumer surplus gain. So this is the consumer surplus gained by setting a maximum price. Why? Of course, since the price decreases, so there's more consumers who are willing and able to buy. And then also we have this triangle here, which is a complete triangle of deadweight loss. And you can be even more specific with it. The top of the triangle is consumer deadweight welfare loss, and the bottom of the triangle is producer deadweight welfare loss. And of course, the reason why the producer deadweight welfare loss happens is since a lower price, so there's less producers who are willing and able to produce at that price. But that last triangle below there will actually show the producer surplus. So even though the price is low, there's still some consumers, there's still some gap between what consumers are willing to produce for and what they actually produce for. But overall, all this does, it just helps you add a few more analysis points where you talk about how the effects of the maximum price. The maximum price, of course, is going to lead to consumer surplus gain, a producer surplus loss, and then, of course, deadweight loss. And you can talk about the specific deadweight losses. And overall, relate this back to the question, would help reduce the household energy prices, help maybe make this figure a bit closer to the original figure, etc, etc. And then, of course, in your 25 marker, you will be expected to have a very high level of evaluation. And how are you going to evaluate this? Now, there are plenty of evaluation points here. I would aim for 2 to 3 here, 100%, since there's so many quality evaluation points. Number one, firstly, you can comment on the excess demand, like I said previously. Since it's like I said, it's a necessity good. There's excess demand, so basically there's not enough supply of a necessity good. That's going to lead to very bad consumer outcomes. So the way I'd phrase it is probably, however, this depends on the shortage caused by maximum prices, and that is actually going to lead to a worse outcome for society overall. And then quote it, use your diagram, show the examiner, pick up those application marks, pick up those diagram marks, show the examiner exactly where that excess demand is, so from QS to QD, and tell me what that means. Now, another great evaluation point that should basically, you can use it in taxes, you can use it in maximum prices, and you've probably heard me say it before, but however, this depends on the size of the maximum price. As if we have a look at this, and just a quick example, if you really wanted to, if you had the time, you could even draw out this example. If we set the maximum price somewhere like here, look how much that amplifies the losses on the diagram. Look how much, if you just look at the producer surplus, look how much smaller the producer surplus is. Look how much larger the excess demand is, for example, and this is going to lead to severe shortages. And so you could say, however, in evaluation, the positive effects or the effectiveness of the maximum price depends on the size of the maximum price. As when the government sets the maximum price, they do not have perfect information. Therefore, if they set the maximum price at a too large value, so if they set the maximum price, the price ceiling too low, it's going to lead to catastrophic, like massive effects on excess demand, massive shortages, massive reductions in producer surplus, thus leading to a much worse allocation of resources. And you can link that to a main thing, which is government failure, where the government have intervened in the market and led to a worsened allocation of resources than before. Now, another great evaluation point is the presence of black markets. So usually we say that by setting maximum prices, for most goods, it's going to lead to black markets. And of course, you could just talk about classic ones like the admin costs of regulation, as they're going to have to spend tax money, allocate resources to like enforcers who make sure these energy firms are charging that maximum price. They're not charging any higher. So you can talk about the opportunity cost of allocating those resources there, whereas you could probably spend those resources on, I don't know, investing into new renewable energy sources, which in the long run could become cheaper. But yeah, like I always say, lots of points for that paragraph. But that is a brief summary on how I would do the maximum price diagram the maximum price paragraph. And then let's move on to the second paragraph, which of course would be the subsidies paragraph. Now, moving on to the second paragraph, and it depends, like I said, you can do a paragraph of maximum prices, one on nationalisation, one on CMA regulation. But if you were doing the subsidies paragraph, like I said, you might pick subsidies and you might pick nationalisation. So you might only do them two paragraphs, since maximum price and subsidies, a lot of the time you're going to be speaking about very similar things. As if you just think about it, subsidies, how are we going to word the question? One possible method the government can intervene to control household energy bills is providing households with subsidies. E.g, the UK provided single-person households in 2023 with a household bill subsidy. And then move on to basically the diagram and the chains of analysis. How would you do this? Of course, you draw a subsidy diagram, which looks something like this. So supply, and then S plus sub, and then the demand curve. Now with the subsidy diagram, like I said, it's a very almost like year 12 diagram. It's a very simple diagram where there's not much you can really speak about unless you annotate it and you add in the points, which is pretty much like we did before, just commenting on the consumer and producer surplus and commenting on how they change. And yeah, and the way I do that is just labeling this up. So A there, B, C, then D, E. As remember one thing, when I'm illustrating diagrams on the iPad, I'm usually just colouring them in, but your exam paper is going to scan in black and white, so it doesn't matter if you use colours in your exam, everything scans in black and white. So if you've just got diagrams like this, where consumer surplus before, consumer surplus after, all the examiner is going to see is black diagrams, and of course that makes it a lot less easy for the examiner to actually identify what you're saying, as how does the examiner know what's the differentiation between them two? So what I would do is, the way I would do it is consumer surplus before and then consumer surplus after. So what is consumer surplus before? It's of course A, B, P, E, so just that triangle there. And then what is consumer surplus after? So after the subsidy. So of course, what does subsidy do? It reduces producers' cost of production, thus shifting the supply curve out to S plus sub, which leads to lower prices for consumers and higher quantity produced. But what is consumer surplus after? It is now this larger triangle, which is A, P1, D. And let's do the same for producer surplus. So what is producer surplus before? So before supply curve, so the original supply curve is this little triangle here, which is PEBC, and then producer surplus after. So once this is our new supply curve, our S plus sub is P1, D, E. So this triangle here now. So basically we go from here to here with producer surplus, and then we go here to here with consumer surplus. And then with regards to evaluation, just the classic evaluation points like opportunity cost of the subsidy. Like I said before, they can maybe allocate these resources, because they talk about energy firms. Instead of subsidising households, they could subsidise eco-friendly energy, thus meaning that they no longer have to rely on these like fossil fuels. With subsidies, the valuation points are always quite simple. One of them is always going to be opportunity cost. And the way you could word this is saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on whether providing subsidies to households is the best way for the government to control household energy bills, as the government could allocate these resources to the process of nationalisation, so changing these energy firms from the private sector to owned by the state, meaning that it would have better long-run effects or impacts on consumers, as it means that by firms, and then you could just basically mention the positive effects of if the energy sector was nationalised, like something like they would buy all the energy, so they could they have more bulk buying power, and then of course, since the government, they want to be allocatively efficient, they want to provide benefit to society, they could maybe even take a bit of a loss, so the society could benefit. And the way you could word that, it all depends on your paragraph. If your third paragraph is not nationalisation, maybe it's more to do with CMA regulation, you could word it saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on whether subsidies to households are the most effective way for the government to control household energy bills, as the government could allocate these resources, allocate the funds from the subsidy to spend on the process of nationalisation, as if the energy sector is nationalised, it would lead to several benefits for consumers, as the state would own the entire energy sector, therefore would experience the benefits of lower prices. So wherever they buy the energy from, they would have lower costs, thus meaning that could be translated to consumers. And things like a nationalised firm is going to be allocatively efficient. It's trying to provide positive externalities. It's trying to provide society with benefits. Therefore, it could lead to better overall outcomes for society. And that is the way, such a simple evaluation point being opportunity cost, you can really transform it into an A-star evaluation point. And what I always try to do with evaluation, even though the stimulus is small, like I always do with my section B evaluation, I'm always trying to relate it to the extract. But here also, you could talk about, however, in evaluation, this depends on the long run, on the longevity of the subsidy, as the government don't know what's going to happen to household energy bill prices in the long run. So they might continue rising. They may become 30,000 in 5 years. No one knows what's going to happen. Therefore, it depends on the sustainability, whether the government can actually continue subsidising every single household in the UK. So it depends on the long run effects of energy bills and energy prices. But yeah, of course, lots of evaluation points there, just a brief overview, brief summary of how I would attempt a paragraph on maximum prices and how I would attempt a paragraph on subsidies. Moving on to the second 25 mark question, let's have a read of this. So evaluate possible methods, so it's asking about methods of government intervention to reduce carbon emissions caused by road transport in the UK. Now, for those of you who have done lots of past papers, who have done lots of essays, this question is very similar to previous questions. And what does this question link to? This question links a lot to previous questions and is very similar to previous questions on market failure / like government failure. So that type of topic area, so market failure, government intervention, of course it mentions government intervention in the question, but it's basically asking you, essentially all the question is policies to solve market failure, and they are very easy, and of course we've learned lots of them. And if you break the question down in smaller chunks, it's talking about carbon emissions, road transport in the UK, and all of these cause negative externalities. So definitely for one of the paragraphs, I would probably write about tax, and then maybe throw in a negative externality diagram, mention a bit of market failure theory in as well, since it's definitely relevant. But just in general, with 25 marker technique, a classic thing students ask me is they'll read a question and their mind will go blank. How do you solve that? Lots of students will literally have the A-star content knowledge where they'll know everything, but still their mind will go blank. And this is why, of course, I always say economics is a double-edged sword. You need your content knowledge to be, you need mastery of content knowledge, but also you need mastery of exam technique to get that A and A-star. But, so you're reading the 25 marker, you go blank. What do? The main thing you need to do is try link it to a topic area. So link it to the big topics in economics you've learned. Try link it to maybe market failure, market structure, so like monopolies, labour markets, whatever it links to, just try link it to a big topic area. Then once you've managed to link it to a topic area, then you can go about thinking about maybe your notes in that topic area, maybe some revision you've done in that topic area, and slowly ideas should pop in your mind. But definitely with the exam pressure and on exam day, you should actually be expecting that when you read some questions, your mind should go blank. You need to prepare for the worst basically, and if it does happen, just use that strategy, link it to topic areas, and slowly the ideas will come flooding in, and then you can go about writing. Okay, so like I said, this is an absolute classic question, and let's just try plan some of the points we can mention. So number one, 100%, if we're talking about trying to reduce the carbon emissions, what is the main strategy you kind of learned with policies to reduce something, maybe reduce consumption, maybe reduce production of something. And the main policy, the first policy that should pop into your mind from your content knowledge is an indirect or just a tax. So you're probably going to do a tax on producers, maybe when producers sell the car or when producers produce new diesel or petrol cars, since of course there is the diesel and petrol cars which do release emissions. And what is the tax trying to do? We're trying to incentivize these producers to stop producing petrol and diesel cars and move towards maybe electric car production, since electric cars are better for carbon emissions. But of course that is an evaluation in itself. Of course electric vehicles, the batteries, they have massive carbon footprints, like absolute massive carbon footprints, and that works as a really good evaluation point, saying that we're trying to incentivize the production of electric vehicles, but it depends on whether electric vehicles are actually that much more sustainable, that much more efficient in terms of carbon emissions than petrol and diesel vehicles. So let's try to just plan some of the policies we would use. So what is the first policy in the main paragraph I believe you should write? So essentially the question is asking us, how can the government reduce the production of carbon emissions? So one of the ways you're going to do that is reduce the production of cars. What is a big way we can do that? Using prices, and your big first paragraph should be taxes, and if you want to be more specific, an indirect tax. Why? How could we use this? Since to reduce carbon emissions, we probably the best case scenario. We haven't actually read the stimulus yet. So this mentioned, what did this actually mention? A petrol car journey from London to Glasgow is 3.3 times more carbon dioxide than by train. But anyway, so if we're indirect taxing, what we're going to do, we're probably going to tax the production of diesel and petrol cars. Why? So what is a tax going to do? If we tax the producers, it's going to increase the cost of production of these diesel and petrol cars. And why will that help reduce carbon emissions? You could say it incentivizes people to buy electric cars, since if diesel and petrol cars are more expensive now, of course electric cars is a substitute. Individuals may substitute away from diesel and petrol cars to electric cars, or producers may just simply stop producing petrol and diesel cars since they're too expensive and just stop producing electric cars. But a great thing to mention with electric cars, and this is just real world application, electric cars themselves, although I think they don't release carbon or carbon dioxide, but they have a massive carbon footprint. They were in the process of making the battery, transporting these massive electrical batteries. They have a massive carbon footprint. So you can also mention the effectiveness of whether we're actually reaching our goal. So our goal is to reduce carbon emissions, but are electric vehicles actually that much more efficient in terms of carbon emissions than petrol and diesel vehicles, since the carbon footprint is so large? And this is just all real world application. It's just like reading the news. I wouldn't particularly suggest students to read the news, since there's a lot of waffle that you won't remember, but just making sure, especially I emphasize it in live classes, make sure if your teacher's teaching, he's including as much application as is just necessary, and it works really well for evaluation. So what would I mention in my tax paragraph? So the first thing and the big thing, and the main thing that's going to drive my chain of analysis, assist me in the chain of analysis, and this is how you need to think of diagrams. If you can use a diagram, it is perfect. Why? Because it just helps you. A lot of students struggle with the length of the chain of analysis, making the chain of analysis step by step. But if you can include a diagram, it makes it, I'd say, like 50% easier. But then it's about having that diagram mastery. This is where in your revision, you need to really strive to understand what the diagram means. You should know every little bit of the diagram. So, for example, in this, we're going to draw a negative externality diagram. So supply equals MPC. You shouldn't just learn the diagram just knowing that it's the supply equals MPC. You should know what marginal private cost actually means and the backstory almost behind it. And that, just learning, if you just want to do it for the main diagrams, just learning what these things actually mean is going to boost your grade, and it's going to make that chain of analysis move from a simple band 2, band 3 chain of analysis to that top level band 4 and band 5 chains of analysis. But yeah, so we're just going to draw a negative production externality diagram. So like I said, supply equals marginal private cost. I have not actually labeled my axis. Demand equals marginal private benefit equals marginal social benefit. And obviously cost slash benefit on this axis, quantity on this axis, and then we have marginal social cost curve, which is obviously above our marginal private cost curve. And how would we show a tax on this diagram? You can do it very simply by just putting a comma there and putting MPC plus tax, since this is of course the perfect size for the tax. Why? Because now the producers are operating at a socially efficient equilibrium. Let's label that on. So what would this equilibrium be? This would of course be the market equilibrium at QE, and then we have where MSC intersects MSB. This is now the socially efficient equilibrium at this point, which is just to label on. That is a socially efficient equilibrium, and the blue point is the market equilibrium. Last few things to label on, just label on the triangle of welfare loss. Of course, how do we work that out? We go from a market equilibrium where supply equals demand, so this blue point here, and you go up or down to the social curve, and the social curve is up in this scenario, so you would just go straight up, and that is your welfare loss. And other thing to label is just the bottom of the diagram, just the difference in QSE and QE is the overproduction. Okay, so how would I actually now use this diagram in my chain of analysis? So let's go about it. So of course, simple normal paragraph structure, A-star paragraph structure video, very good one. Go and watch it if you haven't. But what is the paragraph structure? It's point, application, analysis, link back to question. So it's basically KA paragraph structure, and then at the end you link back to the question. But so I would say one method of government intervention to reduce carbon emissions caused by road transport in the UK. You should be picking up here. What am I doing? I'm reusing literally every single word from the question. One thing examiners will say in examiners' reports, or just say on students' scripts, is that they're not directly answering the question. How do you solve that? You literally use the exact wording from the question and address the question directly, so you can never get that mark or never get marked down for that reason. So one method of government intervention to reduce carbon emissions is by the government setting an indirect tax on producers. Then I would move on to application, saying something like, in the UK, there is a 52 pence per litre of petrol or diesel tax. And that is literally how simple real world application is. You just need to mention a start is always the best. And I really do try go through as many of these as possible in my live classes, because it's so important, and you can almost build like a little fact file of just these stats when I go through them. But so 52 pence per litre is tax, and then I would move on to my chains of analysis. So this part of my paragraph. So then I would probably start by just mentioning that producers before the tax, they start at the market equilibrium. Of course, at the market equilibrium, we are producing at QE. Why is that? Since in the free market, producers only think about their private costs and not external costs. Thus, they overproduce. So they produce at quantity QE, which is of course not at the socially efficient production quantity. Therefore, the government have to intervene. They have to set a tax. So they intervene with MPC plus tax. What does that lead to? It means that by setting a tax, by increasing the producer's private cost of production, it means the overproduction is no longer happening. We are producing at QSE instead of QE, and since there's no longer any overproduction, it means the welfare loss to society, the deadweight loss to society, is no longer happening. As then you can talk about prices. As prices increase from PE to P1, or the cost to producers increase to PE to P1, this could mean these producers could relay these costs onto consumers, so that they could pass these costs onto consumers. Thus, of course, like we were saying, if there's higher costs of petrol and diesel cars, it will incentivize consumers to find other avenues such as electric vehicles or even public transport. So instead of taking a car to work, they might start taking a train to work. And then you can link in this part of the stimulus, saying that E.G. trains are 3.3 times less carbon emissions than a car. So yeah, basically just explaining the diagram a bit, then explaining why the tax works. The tax, you just explain that incentivizes individuals to find other methods of transport, thus reducing the number of emissions, or the quantity of emissions, and that overall achieves the government's goal of reducing carbon emissions. So just that last bit there, mentioning thus overall reaching the government's goal of reducing carbon emissions, that is linking back to the question. The reason why I suggest students do this, one of the biggest problems students have year on year, I've seen it with experience, is students waffle. They start going on tangents, speaking about random things, but always, if you're writing your chain of analysis, and in the back of your mind, if you're always you're always thinking about, okay, I need to eventually link this back to the question, it will stop you going off track, and it'll keep you focused on the question. Since remember, you can write the best economics theory, if it's not to do the question, you won't be picking up any marks. Okay, so moving on to the 9 marks of evaluation you have in your 25 mark question. I am going to go through it quite briefly. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to go through evaluation a bit more in depth, since I feel like well, of course, for me, evaluation is quite simple because I've been teaching this for how many years. But let me know, since a lot of students struggle with evaluation. So if I do get a few comments, I will start making the evaluation a bit more in detail to help you guys out. But how would I evaluate this? So like I said before, what we mentioned, the first point, is just the carbon footprint of electric cars is, of course, absolutely massive. So that means that you can link that to government failure. Why is that government failure? The government have intervened in the market to try and reduce the carbon emissions. However, in reality, it's not a great policy, is it? Since because we're trying to incentivize electric vehicles, but if electric vehicles also have a massive carbon footprint, have massive carbon emissions, it's an example of government failure. Why? Because the government have intervened in the market to try improve the allocation of resources, so improve the carbon emissions, but in reality, they haven't particularly solved it. They haven't internalized the negative externality, you can say. And then, of course, just the size of the tax. You can say the government does not have perfect information on the market. They may set the tax. Okay, so that is the indirect tax paragraph done. But for this question, there are absolutely loads of possibilities and different ways you can. Answer the question. So let's try to think of some more. So basically, methods of government intervention to reduce carbon emissions. So other ones include. So I'm just going to write policies. Other ones include, of course, subsidies. So whatever way you want to subsidise. Maybe you want to subsidise new electric vehicles. Maybe even you want to subsidise public transport. So whatever you want to subsidise, since if you subsidise public transport, again, due to the inverse relationship of demand, when prices fall, quantity demanded increases. Why? Because it incentivises producers to substitute away, since public transport, electric vehicles, petrol, diesel vehicles, so fueled power vehicles, they are all substitutes of each other. So yeah, subsidies is definitely one. I'm not going to go into depth with the paragraph on subsidies, since literally in the last question we just covered the entire chain of analysis for subsidies. I will just do the same thing. Consumer producer surplus, make sure you include it on the subsidy diagram, as it just elevates this from a normal year 12 diagram to a really top level year 13 A star diagram. And of course, just as very brief, subsidy, what does it do? Shift the supply curve out to S plus sub, increases quantity produced and decreases the price. Then you'd mention how there's an increase in consumer and producer surplus, and yeah, just go from there. And evaluations, of course, it depends whether producers respond to the subsidy, opportunity cost of subsidy, and a few more. Okay, and other great policy Okay, another great policy we can use for this question is deregulation. What does deregulation mean? Deregulation, of course, in this scenario would mean in the car industry we reduce legislation. We basically make it easier. We reduce the barriers to entry to enter the car industry market. So the production of cars. Why would this help our goal of reducing carbon emissions? As if you reduce that regulation, it's going to lead to, if you reduce the barriers to entry, it's going to be easier for new entrants, new firms to enter the market. This will therefore increase competition in the market. And when there's more competition in the market, there's more firms in the market, it can definitely lead to innovation. It can lead to the incumbent firms being forced to innovate to maintain their market share, or the new firms just coming in and changing up the market, bringing a new like taste to the market. But by new firms coming into the market, it can lead to investment into these electric cars, into these electric vehicles, thus meaning it's a double positive for the government. Why? Firstly, with something like subsidies, of course, it's going to cost the government to intervene. Something like taxes is still admin costs for the government to intervene, and it can lead to government failure since the government is intervening in the market itself. Whereas, if we think about deregulation, we can class this as a market-based supply-side policy. Since why? Since with deregulation, the government is actually decreasing their intervention in the market. So they have less control of the market. So therefore it reduces the likelihood of government failure occurring, since they are actually, instead of increasing their intervention in the market, they're decreasing their intervention in the market. And with regards to evaluation of deregulation, a great evaluation and a complete polar opposite would of course be just regulation. So however, in evaluation, this depends on whether regulation by, for example, the CMA would be a more effective policy. As maybe the CMA could regulate these car industry producers to stop overcharging maybe for the electric vehicles, or it could regulate public transport. Maybe the trams, the trains, the buses are overcharging consumers. So therefore, regulation may actually be a better policy than deregulation. So it's almost in evaluation there, you're almost weighing up your argument. And it's really good, since in these policy questions, since we're presenting a policy, a great evaluation is actually just presenting another policy that works on the negatives of the policy you presented, that improves on the negatives of the policy you presented. Also, since the majority of the UK population, it's very likely that you watching this are from London. London, of course, have ULEZ, so that is a good bit of application you can include whenever you're thinking about carbon emissions, anything to do with cars. And then some more policies, like, of course, you can do the classic ones, min plus maximum prices. They would, of course, work well here. And like I always say, if you're drawing these diagrams, don't just keep them the simple classic diagram like this. Add in the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, and the where the deadweight welfare loss is, as it just upgrades that diagram, gives you a bit more to speak about in that chain of analysis, thus allowing you to reach those higher levels. And with regards to valuation, I've actually been mentioning quite a lot that they're all substitutes. That public transport, cars, petrol cars, electric cars are all substitutes. But you could 100%, whenever we talk about substitutes, you could discuss the value of the XCD, whether they are strong substitutes or whether they are weaker substitutes. Then, of course, another valuation is time frame. Also, petrol, diesel, it's not a renewable source. So instead of the government intervening, maybe the market itself, and this is a really good evaluation, the market itself maybe is able to solve the market failure. Why? Since petrol and diesel, they're running out, they're non-renewable resources, and this will force the market to innovate. It will force producers to stop allocating more resources towards electric vehicles. Therefore, in the long run, the government does not actually have to intervene, since the market itself will solve the failure of using petrol and diesel cars. But yeah, like you can probably tell, and I've only mentioned probably 40% of the points, there are an absolute abundance of points here. But again, do not try to get too overwhelmed with the variety of points. Pick your points, whether it's tax, subsidies. If that's your 2 paragraphs, focus on them. In your final judgment, you can throw in things like deregulation, maximum minimum prices, but focus on your points. Of course, step-by-step chain analysis, break everything down, and yeah, that should be more than enough. And this is a really, really good question. And if you get something like this in your exam, you should be chuffed, because this is a very nice one. And you can 100%, if you've done your practice, score 20 plus, score anywhere around 25 on this. Okay, so what are the main takeaways from this paper? Firstly, just like your content knowledge needs to be solid. Of course, that is quite general advice, but for example, I believe we got, if I remember correctly, you did get examined on things like XCD here. That is it's quite niche, to be honest, but just make sure for your section A especially, make sure you've got those bits revised. And then if I do this every time, I can say this every single time, make sure you're solid on your application. It's just it's a cornerstone of your grade, and you need to make sure you are learning it somehow. And a really good way, join the live classes. We do teach a heck of a lot of application. But yeah, that is 2023 paper 1 done.